very powerful talk, Candice and Marius. Thank you for sharing how colonizers and uranium companies terrorize indigenous people by treating them as guinea pigs for horrifying experiments and destroying their natural resources for profit and war, despite the extremely disastrous impacts of these on the environment and the communities and future generations. So it's terrifying what science is used for in the hands of the greedy and powerful. So our next speaker is an engineer who has experience in both the academe and the industry. He has worked with the International Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, or ICHRP, as well as the organization Science for the People. Let's all welcome our next speaker, JD.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right, give me 1 second. So I'd like to thank ILPS Commission 13 for being here, and the two previous speakers for their powerful testimonies and their powerful analysis. I'm here to present a perspective from that of a engineer, scientist, in that sector that sort of does the work of science. And, so that brings the question what science is and how we define it. And science is usually seen to be the process of knowledge production that's taken or like pursued through the use of the scientific method. So science is a curious thing, and we at Science for the People like to see it through the lens of a dual nature. So this is this page was taken off the website where it talks a bit about that. So science has a really good PR, and that it's taken as usually just like a net sum positive thing for society. But it deserves, just like most institutions, a critical lens. And science is an institution other than just a body of knowledge. And so this sort of underlines the two parts of science, right? So we like to see it as one, a way of advancing human knowledge, that body of knowledge through human labor. And two, just like most things that are put into practice, it's not free of historical context, right? So like science, very much came from the Enlightenment, just like many liberal institutions, like capitalism, which undergirds so many facets of our society today. And so science, the practice of science, is very much a capitalist enterprise. And we at Science for the People like to examine exactly how those facets are expressed. And so we can form an analysis as to how it is not serving the people's needs as capitalism, through the Marxist lens, has shown not to. So this bit on militarism, again, through like the Marxist vernacular, talks about the contradiction that comes about from science as a tool of capitalist advancement. And this was pointed out very powerfully by Win Mon when you saw that there's so much more money lent to militarism, right? And the science, the scientific tools that's lent towards the military industrial complex, then say things that would benefit people, like roads for Candace and Marius's community that they said was promised as a feature of prosperity that their community deserves, but was never given, right? So in a way, like budgets are sort of a zero-sum thing, right? Like if you're putting money, I mean, you have a finite fixed budget for the year, you're putting money towards tanks and guns, you're not putting it to those roads. And I'll feature this again later, but like, this is the American budget. For the American budget for the past couple of years, and really this has spanned a couple of decades now, you know, but for this current year and for last year, more than 50% of the budget was allotted to defense spending, and less than 15% was allotted for infrastructure. And so, you know, this features like the priorities of our current administration, but actually it's the same for, you know, like even democratic, you know, administrations from Obama to Clinton. It's really a feature of post-World War II neoliberalism. So should advance from this slide, but that is to say, you know, like Science for the People is an organization that likes to commit itself to coming to grips with how science functions in society. So just to highlight the dual nature, consider the Haber process, which was a technique developed by Haber, I think it's how it's pronounced correctly, in Germany during World War I. And so on the right side, you see that, so in the Haber process,
JD, please update your slides. It's not showing up.
Oh, okay. How about now? I advanced it from, I'm now on slide 2. Can you see it?
Only on the side. We can only see a little point of it on the side. On the left side.
Interesting. Let's see here. Okay. How about now?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. It's good.
Okay. Thank you. So the Haber process is a way of synthesizing ammonium, which is to introduce nitrogen into things. So before this process, you know, people had to dig up guano, right, for fertilizer, but this synthetic production allowed us to make it, right, which was a boon to the to world agriculture, in like feeding people, right, you know, to the needs of ending world hunger. That same process allowed for the proliferation of explosives during that very same era, with that very same scientist that was recommitted to the war effort for Germany, and actually like helping Germany to be in good standing in the war, that is World War I. So I show you the slide to show like, oh, like this is sort of an expression of that dual aspect, in that like one, it very much can, you know, do great things for people's needs. On the right side, it's fertilizer, and on the left side, lead to furthering the means of destruction. And so the same with nuclear theory. So on the left is a photo, I believe, of the fission bomb, the atom bomb, that was detonated on Nagasaki, one of the worst atrocities of the modern era. that in Hiroshima that we commemorate and lament today. On the right side is a nuclear power plant. So the one above is fission, and the one below is a prototype for a fusion plant, right? So I was going to present this as the flip side, like I did in the previous slide for the Eber process, but like as Candace so powerfully pointed out, right? There are a lot of drawbacks to this type of technology that's often not echoed in the halls of power or academia where I came from, right? So like it speaks to the alienation of powerful stakeholders that actually suffer the impacts of this technology, and further highlights the elite capture of something like the Institution of American Science, and I'm sure abroad too in Canada, being another great Western player. Oftentimes the conversation in these on these tables and these board meetings is what good a technology can do for capitalists, right? Or like whatever blocks of power, where the money is. And often traditionally alienated and disempowered communities don't get a say. So, I just wanted to problematize and like show the problematic feature of my own presentation, especially trailing right after Candace's stories and testimony. So, so going from nuclear theory and the topic of war, we now live in an era where the means of destruction has reached a point where we can completely obliterate ourselves, right? Like as a human species, so our tool making has progressed so well that we've created our own contradiction to where, it can ultimately result in an end game where there's no creation at all, at least not by humans. So this said, producers, scientific workers like Albert Einstein, one of the most preeminent of our era, to lament his own influence in creating the bomb, right? And Einstein, along with Leo Szilard, was sort of forced, because they were both Jewish refugees from Europe, driven out by Hitler, and the word on the beat, the word on the street was that Hitler was developing a bomb, and they did not want Germany to win. But like we can also see this as another outcome of capitalist competition, right, in the arena of war, that produce these like antithetical results, antithetical outcomes to well-being, to where they're forced to a decision where they had to create something they never really wanted in the first place. No one really ever wanted in the first place. So in the aftermath of the war, Einstein, along with Bertrand Russell, came out with this manifesto, to codify their fear, along with the organization, Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, that calls for complete abolition. And it's the interesting thing about this manifesto is it doesn't just call for the abolition of nuclear armaments, it calls for the abolition of war, right? You'll see at the last, the sixth point. There's no solution to this problem except international control of atomic energy, sure one, and ultimately the elimination of war. Because they knew, as science functions, now we've developed the technique, there's always a way to bring it back, right? Like people are ingenious beings. And so like the way they saw it really it's a social problem, right? Where the end goal should be to eliminate war itself. And that is also to highlight the calls to action that Win Mon laid out along with end US-led war. So another feature of like the modern era with regards to global war was Vietnam, sort of landing on the page of American-led wars. Vietnam was incredibly, I mean, I wasn't alive then, but like as a student of history, Vietnam was incredibly controversial. It's very much an imperialist war, right? It was part of the containment strategy of America to contain their once allies, the USSR and China, that killed the revolution. So because of the Vietnam War, the reverberations back in the US led to a student movement, right? Concurrent with the civil rights movement, the draft resistance movement, and nuclear weapons abolition. That was the result of post-World War II geopolitics, just we talked about in the previous slide. And out of that came Science for the People out of MIT, which, you know, I interviewed some folks in the org and one particular person that was around during that time. And the way he saw it was that was very much anchored on class interest with students, in that like there was strong interest in ending the draft, right? Because people didn't want to get conscripted to war, which is it's a very understandable drive, right? To not risk your life. But you know, the result of that movement, and I believe it was Nixon that ran on this, was to end exactly that, right? And the fact that the draft ended because the draft ended, the anti-war movement kind of took a hit from some perspectives. Although, you know, as we'll talk about, it is very much alive and sort of not given its due. Because one of the concurrent movements, which is a people movement, just like Science for the People was part of, is nuclear disarmament, right? So there was an iconic rally, people's rally in June 1982 to freeze the arms race. And by some accounts, like some historical analyses, this not often heard of, at least with my generation, that you know, and I'm a millennial. You don't hear about this, but people give it due for completely containing nuclear holocaust when the political conditions between Reagan and Russia came to its lowest point, right? And Reagan was a war hawk, and it was the voice of this people thronging together, Americans and I believe worldwide, you know, not wanting to see the aftermath of nuclear fallout, right? It was because of that movement that Reagan was tempered, right? That Reagan pushed for denuclearization. You know, it's I guess also a lesson of how history is told, because oftentimes the mainstream, we could call liberal accounts, is that Reagan and Gorbachev were great people with level heads, but you know, when historians look back, that was actually not the case. Not their administration, not Reagan's administration, which he filled with war hawks. It was this people's movement that put them in check. Dialing forward in almost present day, a couple of years ago, 2017, on the right side, you'll see that ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Which is essentially the same movement, but a different generation. Like, so this is carried forward. And I believe ICANN is like a consortium or a coalition of many grassroots organizations. Most of them, I believe in the leadership, are youth-led. And so they pushed forward the treaty, was it the TPNW treaty, in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's and whose signatories are mostly from the global south, right? So it's youth-led, right? And it's pushed through by usually people, nations who are rendered voiceless in the global arena. For someone who consumes the news rather voraciously, like, these are not accounts that you hear, and it's really bothersome. You know, I don't know if it's because we struggle as people to tell story this way, you know, to tell stories that are not instantiated or pushed forward by individuals, but you know, it's this mass movement that's keeping a nuclear holocaust at bay. Just highlight this next slide. Right, so the TPNW, again being Grassroots International, is actually expected to become international law this next year. So this would be the first law that calls for the abolition of nuclear arms, which is a great feat because it is an existential crisis that has existed for decades, like since the invention of the atom bomb. And mind you, you know, like the nuclear armaments that we have now are I believe at least like 1,000, so that's 3 orders of magnitude times more destructive than the ones unleashed on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So, you know, they won't just destroy ports, they'll destroy cities, like mega cities like Moscow, New York City, London, Chicago. Not in an instant, in a flash, not to mention the fallout and the environmental damage that would ensue. So that third bullet point is to talk about defense conversion, which is, again, something I haven't heard of until I started doing this research for this talk. Defense conversion it was a movement that started in the fallout of World War II, right? And fallout of the New Deal as created and implemented by FDR's administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that was what, like, they call it military Keynesianism, where they got the US and the world out of the Great Depression by creating stuff. But that stuff, you know, coming out of World War II was mostly tanks and guns, right? Like stuff for war. And so people were level-headed enough and forward-looking enough at the time to see, you know, we have to stop making this stuff. Like, there is no more war. So there's actually been a few attempts to go from a war economy to a people's economy. But, you know, I'm not a historian, like history expert on this, but, you know, it's apparently these imperialist wars, right? Like Vietnam, Korea, that kept on happening, where the US kept on stepping its foot in an attempt to resist decolonization, right? In an attempt to assert its power as really the lone imperial power, you know, opposite of Russia at the time, but ultimately after the Berlin Wall, actually the lone imperial power of the world. So anyway, all that to say that, war is one of our great existential crises of the day, right? And it's not the only one. People are well aware that, there's climate change and catastrophe in our wake, as long as right now we're sitting through a global pandemic. And so, to go back to Winmon's great slide with the military budget distribution, like we have to ask ourselves, why is so much money being apportioned to that first bullet point for nuclear modernization of the modern stockpile, and further, war machine creation, and not these other two, right? For climate change and pandemic. There's an article I read recently with regards to the pandemic that shows that, like, the U.S., so this is from the United States context, that actually the Trump administration knew this was coming, because they have, although Trump is not a very smart person, he has some smart people in his employ in the administration, your Dr. Fauci's or what have you. So they saw this coming, and they developed a plan, and they abandoned it, right? Because it wasn't politically amenable. Something like, they realized that, if the COVID virus were to break out even further, it's probably gonna break out in the cities, and then they could blame the blue states for it, which is gross and immoral. But what they also found out through that research is that the diagnostic testing landscape across the nation is very fractured, right? And deserves integration. So they could have put dollars on that as the federal government and tied things together, but that didn't happen, right? And so on climate change, there is a scientist that I follow. It's actually from San Francisco, and he heads Other Lab. And there was a great Vox article on this, where we can implement a World War II type New Deal program to shift the economy, right? So this is an opportunity to implement conversion. We can shift from a war economy to one championing green technologies, right? Which is not without its own contradictions, right? Like, so actually that article, about the Other Lab, that article features electrification, right, as the main strategy. And for electrification, that is to implement batteries, to make everything more efficient. So anything that has a gas engine, replace it, right? Whether it's like a lawnmower motor or cars, which is a big thing, replace it with electric batteries. Electric batteries require mining. And as we've heard from Candace, right? Like mining as a practice, as it's been practiced, has usually gone about, right, via capitalist plunder, via the ignoring of indigenous voices and the well-being of their communities. I can't point to it right now, but there was a feature in one of the Science for the People articles about lithium mining in Latin America, I believe in Bolivia, which, as we know now, after the ousting of Evo Morales, the lithium internationals, the lithium multinationals have descended on the country, which is very rich in that element, in that mineral. So you know, I think it's incumbent on scientists and science workers, whatever engineers, you know, everyone involved in the production of these industries to wake up to these issues. And that's something that Science for the People say, which is really centered on the magazine, looks to do. So, you know, we've revitalized in 2014. The organization has been on hiatus since 1990, you know, since its creation in the 60s, and we're still getting our footing. So, you know, I think a big deal for us is to partner with organizations like Resist U.S.-led War or End U.S.-led War. Yeah, you know, and to push the people's movement forward. And that is also to highlight the issues of production, you know, as workers, and how these things are.
Can you please conclude your presentation shortly, please?
Oh yeah, sure.
That's just for the sake of time. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm on my last slide. So I wanted to give a shout out to, say, the Poor People's Campaign, who has a moral budget, who's calling for this reduction in the federal budget, in the U.S. budget. And so science, I think, also offers a politics of hope and joy, right? That is, you know, to replace sort of the despondent, like depressing things that has come out of the institutions with something that we can aspire to in a very Star Trekian future, you know, featuring like 3 projects that I think are great. That is, you know, that is not for war, right? One is like the LIGO project, which discovered the gravitational waves. Another is the discovery of the Higgs boson by the Large Hadron Collider, and that last slide to the very right is the Hubble telescope. So I think these opportunities are open to us, and that, you know, it just requires this people's movement to push those people-centered projects forward. Thank you.